Every week, so much happens in your own country that it's hard to keep track of the news at home, let alone around the world. So the Global Summary is our weekly rundown of the biggest news events from around the globe. In the next 8 minutes, I'm going to walk you through some of the week's biggest news stories, but we'll be moving fast. So if you want to find out more about any of the stories, then there's article recommendations in the description. This week's biggest stories include the ongoing situation in Israel and Palestine, Colombia's ongoing protests, and the EU rejecting Biden's vaccine plans. Before we start though, make sure you're subscribed and ring the bell to be notified every time we put out a global news video. Thanks so much for your support. Our first story, and probably the biggest story in the world right now, is the situation in Israel and Palestine. We discussed the history, the complex borders, and the factors which have led to the latest conflict in a video we released last week, and if you haven't seen that yet, I'd recommend you do before continuing with this one. Anyway, for those of you who are familiar with the situation, here's what happened over the weekend. On Saturday, the Israeli military continued their assault on Hamas by firing missiles into Gaza. This time though, they targeted the Al Jallah building, which contained journalists from both Al Jazeera and the Associated Press. As is common, the Israeli military warned the building owner an hour before the strike so that people could evacuate. According to Al Jazeera, the building owner pleaded with the Israeli military, asking them to delay the strike by 10 minutes so that journalists could retrieve their camera equipment, but the military refused. The reason given by the Israelis for this attack was that it housed Hamas military intelligence. They claim that Hamas deliberately places military targets at the heart of densely populated civilian areas in the Gaza Strip, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claiming it was not an innocent building. It's clearly not just those in the region paying attention to these developments though, with those around the world watching closely to see what happens next. Some have also taken action, with protests erupting in cities from Baghdad and Amman to Berlin and London. We will of course update you as the story plays out, so make sure to subscribe. Speaking of protests, let's discuss a country and a movement that many of you have been asking for us to cover: Colombia. Protesters in the country have been demonstrating for about 3 weeks in a movement that started following a government proposal to increase taxes for millions of Colombians. These tax increases would have been particularly painful for many Colombians, with the economy hit hard by COVID. You may have heard all of this a few weeks ago when the issue first erupted, but as I mentioned, protests have continued despite the government withdrawing the proposed tax hike. The government likely hoped that by withdrawing the plans, the controversy would die down, but protests have continued, with many now arguing in favour of universal basic income, free university tuition, and police reform. That last one is probably most poignant, as the police's handling of the protests has been lambasted globally. The UN quickly came out against the police's violence, but even since those first deadly days, the death count has continued to rise, with the country's human rights ombudsman reporting at least 42 protesters have now been killed. This is something the country will need to get to grips with though, because protests aren't expected to die down anytime soon. The issue with taxes may have subsided, but the people's grievances with their government certainly have not. Last week, we reported that Joe Biden was supporting waiving patent protections on COVID vaccines, which could, in theory, increase production by allowing other manufacturers to supply doses. We said at the time that for this to be successful, a number of other countries, including EU nations, would also need to get on board. Well, last week at an EU summit in Portugal, this exact proposal was discussed, with EU leaders opting to reject the idea. The European Council president commented on the proposal, saying that the Union didn't believe this was the right solution. President Macron also spoke out against the idea, saying that there isn't one factory in the world that can't produce doses for poor countries because of intellectual property, and that the Anglo-Saxons must first stop their export bans. The argument out of Europe is that the bigger issue is export bans put in place by the US and UK, which block production, as well as calling on Western nations to donate more vaccines to poorer countries. But what do you think? Are patents the issue, or is the hold-up due to a lack of donations and vaccine hoarding? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's stay on COVID for a quick update from India. Last week we discussed the worsening situation in the country, and unfortunately I have to report that that is continuing. Recent days have seen a slight drop-off in cases, but these numbers often hide the truth. With cases continuing to spread in rural areas of the country, most experts agree that without sufficient testing infrastructure, millions of cases and hundreds of thousands of deaths are being missed from the official count, which currently tallies at 274,000 deaths. Even those who survive face a much tougher time in the country post-COVID. Prior to the pandemic, 4.3% of Indians earned less than $2 a day, a number which has jumped to 9.7%. That's 134 million people, with some 230 million Indians now below the poverty line. Add to that, 60% of Indian health expenses are paid out of pocket. That's paid directly at the point of use, no socialised healthcare or insurance to pick up the tab. That means that when people fall ill, the costs to their families can be huge, with many now unable to pay for the funerals of their deceased family members, having spent all of their money attempting to cover healthcare costs. Taiwan has until recently been one of the most successful countries in managing the pandemic, with only 12 deaths since the start. Protected by tough travel restrictions and quarantine requirements, the island largely prevented the virus from entering the country, allowing for the use of only fairly light touch restrictions. Well, that was until case counts began to rise, with 207 cases in one day last week. Since then, the country has been forced to start issuing serious restrictions for the first time, in an attempt to prevent the virus from becoming widespread. These restrictions might still feel pretty loose compared to some other countries, with the UK living under tougher restrictions pretty much since the start of the pandemic. But the country's hoping that this will be enough to stop the need for a first full lockdown, and we wish them the best. Let's end with some good news out of the pandemic. It's been reported that since the pandemic began, Britain's literacy rate has been increasing, as has children's enjoyment of reading. This might seem counterintuitive, with many children out of school, but studies from the National Literacy Trust and the University of Dundee found that children have been turning to books as an escape and to keep them entertained. According to the NLT study, 56% of children enjoy reading either very much or quite a lot, up quite significantly from the pre-COVID level. On top of that, a third of children reported that reading helped cheer them up when they couldn't see their friends or family. Let's hope that even with many countries starting to open up more and more, children are able to still find time to get lost in a good book. So those are some of the biggest global news stories from the last week, and if 8 minutes wasn't enough for you, then there's links to further reading in the description. If you think we missed anything, then comment below the stories you'd like to see us cover in future episodes. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and ring the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.